Hi, everyone. Many thanks for checking out this panel. My name is Courtney, and I'll be facilitating our discussion, Is Hunger the Biggest Lockdown Threat Today? Joined by Maya and Wandile. I'm an equity strategist and the founder of Urban Fireworks, a consulting and research firm leveraging innovation to build inclusion. My work is rooted in the deconstruction and the redesigning of systems that oppress and marginalize communities, with the epicenter of these communities empowered as designers themselves. I'm joined today by Maya da Silva, agronomist with the Master's of Science in Agronomy. Her research topic was the productivity potential and the environmental impacts of small and large-scale agricultural systems in Kenya as well as Mozambique. She is currently working at ZZ2 on their COVID response team, focusing on risk assessments, protocol development, and implications of response plans. We'll also be joined by Wandile Sihlobo, the chief economist at Agbiz, and one of Melon Guardian's top 200 young South Africans. Wandile and Agbiz are excited about this honor as the Melon Guardian received more than 6,000 nominations from the public of dream chasers and change makers that will build South Africa into everything it has the potential to be. Thank you, Maya and Wandile, for your work and for being here to discuss today. Thank you also to The Forge for this labor of love, for hosting these panel sessions, focusing on the pertinent challenges that are facing South Africa and many places across the world during this pandemic. So as I mentioned, we'll be talking about systems of change. We'll be talking about systems that are impacting hunger. And we're focusing on the question, is hunger the biggest lockdown threat? I would like to note that there are layers of challenges that impact hunger, including pre-existing food vulnerability, the impacts of natural disasters, strained and overworked production systems, a need for government-assisted distribution, the criminalization and feminization of hunger, the disruption the pandemic has caused to inter-country and intra-country travel, increased job insecurity and income volatility, especially for those that are in the informal economy, abusive price gouging by retailers, the lockdown restrictions that impact transportation movement, who's deemed essential, access to electricity, access to paraffin, and access to water are just some of the barriers to name. Additionally, all of these challenges have further implications for houseless communities, migrant populations, mining communities, women, children, those identifying as LGBTQ+, and compounded for persons representing two or more of these identities. Today, we'll focus the conversation on agricultural production and how the pandemic has affected large, small, and medium-sized farming practices in South Africa, in Southern Africa. There are over 180,000 small-scale farmers and approximately 4,000 larger-scale farmers in South Africa. Additionally, there are micro-farmers, community gardeners, there are subsistence fishermen who provide food for their communities. There are millions of people who are part of the informal trade market as well, and they provide a bridge for billions of people to have access to food on a regular basis. Lots of these both farm production, subsistence fishermen, as well as informal market traders have been cut off from their income, as well as being able to provide food in this time. And those are just some things to bring to the forefront as we get started with our conversation. So I would love to start with kind of understanding the size and scale breakdowns of farm and farming practices. So I'll hand it over to Maya and Wandile to speak to those things.
I can start maybe just by posing a question and maybe an idea as well, and Wandile, please interject if there's anything. But I think when trying to define these groups, we also, it's not like these strict sets of like, this is a small scale, this is middle, medium, this is large. Because when you start creating these definitions, you can leave a lot of people out if they don't fit into those boxes exactly. And what we need to understand about farming systems is that they are diverse, and there are different farming practices that respond to environmental conditions, capital, etc. And so I think it's, even though from a perspective in Mozambique, we can understand that there are maybe structural systems in place, policies and things that are impacting these different farming systems. So for example, in Mozambique, you'll find that there's a lot of foreign investment into large-scale agricultural systems, whereas small-scale farming systems are more supported by government programs and NGOs, and most of the time they actually have no support. There are no safety nets for these small-scale farmers who are not really formalized. And so I think it's important to understand these structural systems of maybe inequality according to scale and to productivity. But at the same time, we can't think that just because they're a small scale farmer, they're not going to be successful and that they're not resilient. And just because it's a large scale system, that it's not vulnerable. And so I think when talking specifically about also this COVID-19 threat, it's almost more useful to think about what makes an agricultural system resilient to change and able to adapt to the COVID-19 threat. So not every small-scale system is going to need the same response. Not every large-scale system is going to need the same response. And so we need to think maybe what are the factors that are impacting this resilience and this vulnerability. That's my side on that question.
Yeah, on my side, which is where I'll speak generally about the South African agricultural economy or agricultural sector. As you all know, that during the COVID-19 regulations, food has generally been an essential product, just like medicine and stuff. So from the basis of that, South Africa's agricultural sector has not been hard hit by the COVID-19 as the other sectors of the economy. In all of the data that is coming through, in all of the conversations that we have with various players, at least the lockdown has been roughly about 3 weeks or so. So you can't really come up with the conclusive view of any evidence to say in the food system, this has been much of an impact or not. Any of those things, they usually registered more from a household level, which is on a consumer side. But if you're on the farming side, we haven't really seen on that. But obviously the picture has not been generally uniform. There are some particular subsectors which were closed off to a certain extent. You think of the wool sector, you think of the wine sector, you think of the cotton sector. All of those for a larger period of the past 3 weeks, they were not really operating, at least from a trading perspective, even though people could harvest and do all other things. And all of those sectors are important in South Africa, supporting all various households that we have. Because if you think of the wool sector, for example, it's largely small-scale farmers that are probably doing 40 to 50% of that. And those are the guys in the Transkei, as well as to a certain extent in the Ciskei area of the Eastern Cape. While in the wine sector, it's largely people that are more on a commercial sector as well as on a cotton side. All of those sectors, they've been locked up for that particular period. But I wouldn't necessarily say because they were out of market for 3 weeks, they are now to a certain extent that they can't be operational. I think people could still survive. And if you're a small scale farmer, it's even much better there because some of the trade that you do is largely on an informal basis where you were pretty much able to continue within that particular period. And the segmentation of the farming community in South Africa, just generally at large. I mean, you have roughly 40,000 commercial farmers. By commercial here, we mean anyone that has a turnover of over 500,000 rands. And if you are less than that, we'll classify you as a smallholder farmer. So the sizes of the farms in South Africa, technically, we measure them in terms of your level of a turnover, not so much about the area that you farm and all of that. And in as far as the food sector or the food system that is coming on in a formal retail chain, that usually comes from those guys that are largely within the 40,000 farmers, if you had to look at it in a volumes perspective, even though that some that are not in that 40,000 farmers, they also operating. So generally speaking, and looking at the agriculture economy, impact of COVID-19 has somewhat been largely minimal compared to where the other sectors of the economy has been. But obviously there's a lot that is yet to be learned over the coming months. What perhaps maybe we worried a lot about is saying, for how long will this pandemic last? And obviously if it drags on, say, to around about August, which will be the time where we are preparing for the next season, then you can start to think about what will be the implications and the people's ability to get back to the fields. But in as far as harvesting and all other things, relatively fine. Demand muted for the products, but not in a bad way. So we are in business.
Thank you very much. And so what are some of the implications of the restrictions that have impacted the farms, whether they be small holder farms or subsistence fishermen, or your commercial, as you suggested, or larger scale farms? How has the South African lockdown, the declaration of a state of disaster impacted the movement of food from farms, the ability of persons who labor at the farms to get to work? How have those things impacted the farms?
I can say from the perspective of, being working at a farm, lockdown has actually been beneficial. The point of lockdown was also to protect essential workers so that we could continue with activities and limit the spread to those essential workers as well. And so we can say that things have actually been safer under lockdown. Production continued, packing continued, but this at the same time is coming from a business that is resilient, that is able to adapt to the change. So for example, with getting your employees to the farm, we were able to bring in more trucks so that we could decrease capacity, able to issue PPE, able to provide sanitation, able to construct systems that allow for social distancing. And so because, we have that capacity, we're able to respond to the threat and keep the business going, because it's twofold. You're not just looking at continuing the business, but also limiting the spread. So when responding, you need to look at both of those things and balance them. So I think the threat now comes, even though it's positive that we're moving into level 4, it's a really great thing, especially because it's been really difficult for a lot of people under lockdown conditions. But what it does is that it does increase the threat level for continuation of business. Because I think what needs to be understood also, at least from our perspective, is that, and most African countries, is that where people are involved throughout the whole agricultural system, from propagation to planting to maintenance of the crop, your pruning, your weeding, everything that's done to then harvesting, packaging, getting it to the market, it's all dependent on people. And so we really need to make sure that those people are healthy, are safe, and that the system is able to protect, or the agribusiness is able to protect those people so that business can continue.
Something important to understand about an agricultural production system is that it doesn't operate in isolation. And so this means that if your supply chain or your service providers or your market is not functioning as it should be, then that can be a problem for food production and getting the product to the market at the end of the day. But that's not, under lockdown conditions, that hasn't been an issue. Supply chains have been functional, service providers have been able to get to the farms, and product has been able to get to the market. So luckily all of that is fine. But if COVID becomes a bigger issue, hopefully it won't, then these are aspects that need to be taken into consideration, and risk needs to be mitigated at all of the points. It's not just about production on the farm. You need to really look at the whole system and understand that it's an open system. We're all connected, and yeah, it needs to be managed in that way.
Wandile, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, look, the point that Maya is emphasizing now is exactly what you see when you look at every commodity in South Africa, or every level of a farm unit. The supply chains have been resilient. Obviously, the first 2 days after the lockdown, there were a lot of regulations that were not in place, and they did cause some bit of inconvenience in the fresh produce markets and the other areas, but that was quickly solved. So as we speak now, I would say South African supply chains of the entire agricultural sector has been relatively operating well. And I think the other message that has been able to get to those in the entire value chain is the ability that they need to prioritize health. Because if they don't do that, I mean, you end up with a situation. If you now look at Canada, you look in parts of the US, you have a lot of meat plants that had a lot of their staff affected by the coronavirus, and leading now to a shutdown of there. And the results have been pretty much ugly so far at what we are seeing. So fortunately in South Africa, it's been probably one plant that has been affected by coronavirus, and that didn't really cause a lot of disruption in the supply chain. We've been able to manage that. And I think the other thing in South Africa that has been useful is also the fact that a large part of our food is not consumed through the restaurant as maybe we made thought before. So that portion which no longer goes to restaurant was able to be moved to the grocery market. Again, if you look at the point of somewhere in Europe or in the United States, you had probably in the US roughly 20% of their food being consumed through the restaurant and the feeding scheme, school feeding scheme. Now, with those out, the farmers were lost out of the market and forced to throw things out away. In South Africa, at least, we're not there. So that has been useful. But that being said, we still do have a portion of the food, particularly those that are doing urban farming and closer to the bigger cities, that were specialized on maybe specializing in lettuce or whatever vegetable for a particular restaurant. And now with those restaurants out over the past few weeks, that has been a bit more negative for those few players that are in those areas. So the hope is that with now the level 4 coming in, and many people, even those that are in the food retail sector in the cities, will be back online and they'll be able to deliver their food to South Africans. And I think that now those few players that might have been broken out of the supply chain might be able to link back, and you have that system going. So the picture is looking relatively better on there. But I would say the one point that has caused discomfort, and I mean, it's bad coming from people like myself, who also have responsibilities in government, but where the shortfall has been on policies, that you have this situation where warm foods and everything else can be delivered from level 4 to people that are ordering. But that policy on its own, it causes a little bit of a problem, because it has some elitist sort of way, because if you are in poor areas, you are unable to actually participate or order some of those things. So it really privileges those that have the resources on that end. So I think that's something that has been overlooked, but also the issue of making sure that the restaurant and the other outlets, they are serving warm foods. I think that that's something that has been overlooked, which might need to be revised. But we are having conversation with the lawmakers about correcting those things. But I think that's the short gaps. But in a bigger scheme of things, in far as the supply chain of food, they haven't caused much of a disruption. But from the consumer side perspective, they have caused a bit of a disruption in there. And those are some of the things that we're continuously monitoring.
Thank you, Wandile. So from what I'm hearing from you guys is that the agricultural production system has continued to work, and it's worked efficiently. But what we're finding on the ground is that people are hungry, and not just houseless and highly vulnerable, house insecure folks, but immigrant communities, migrant communities, mining communities in our townships. If people are hungry, starving, there has been looting associated with hunger, and not just people are lacking access to food, people are also lacking access to water, are experiencing locusts in addition to a pandemic. What, if you can, what are some of the breakdowns that could be potentially being experienced in between the farm and people being able to eat? Does food leave commercial farms and your, commercial grocery stores? I actually don't know the answer to this, so I'm really asking, what are some of the things that are happening in between the farm if production continues and people being able to eat? And is it potentially in small-scale farmers not having as much access to continue farming?
Yeah, maybe let me just jump in, Courtney, before Maya on this one, because the issue of people going hungry and all of that is not an agricultural question, but it's a social policy question in a large part. Because what is happening is, if you look at food security and you were to define it on its basic forms, you are looking at nutrition, availability, and affordability. What we are having is that, at least from a South Africa perspective, you do have the supply, which is on an availability and the nutritious side. But what you are suffering with in some communities is the issue of affordability. And that has to do a lot with people now that are working in some other businesses that have been shut down, but some were already maybe in some informal businesses that depended on people's mobility in order to be able to have some sort of income, which then income of what is used on buying food. So those are some of the things that have actually put people in some of the worst conditions. But I must say, though, that the lawmakers of the country, yes, they might have reacted slightly late, but understandably so when you're looking at the economic conditions of the country. Because right now we do have food vouchers that are being put out across the country. There are also food parcels, yes, not at a satisfactory level, but those are beginning to provide some bit of a relief on assisting people. The countries that I'm worried a lot about is actually not in South Africa in as far as food supply, but rather if you think about Zimbabwe, if you think slightly about parts of Mozambique, and probably Maya will speak about this, if you think about Kenya, if you think about Uganda, and the entire East Africa, that's where I'm worried a lot about. Because so in South Africa, for example, we export in value terms about half of what we produce. So supply is going to be there, but our neighbors are at a position where, if you think about stable grain like maize in Zimbabwe, this year they are only producing less than half of what they consume. They consume 2 million tons. They're expecting 800,000 tons of maize. Last year it was the same situation. And the previous years, they might have been able to import because at least their currencies were a bit firm. Now you have a macroeconomic crisis. You have a scarcity of food. All of these problems, and East Africa, those locusts and all the other things that have devastated agriculture. So those are some of the countries that I worry a lot about. But on a South Africa perspective, it's really more of an income perspective. And obviously, as I close off on this point, on the migrant labor question, you are right on that, because we do know that some of the other immigrants in South Africa, they work in some of the other industries like hospitality industry and all of those. So with those being shut down in this period, there is no income in those communities. And there will be a slight increase in the levels of hunger if there were no savings, which is where I think that as we roll out the food parcels, we need to have consideration also for non-South Africans, and not only while we prioritize South Africans, but I think considerations needs to be given to other people that are in the land. Because if we don't do that, you get to have all other social instabilities that will come up in the community, and that won't be good for anyone. And I think that the lawmakers, they need to think thoroughly about that. And I know we are fiscally constrained, but we might have to think about what to do about those problems that are in those communities.
I really have nothing more to add. I think Wandile said it perfectly, and I can even say from on the farm level, food is being produced, food is being sent to the market, food is at the market. So it really is a question of affordability, and not and that cannot change from the food production side either. You know, costs still need to be covered. It's just, yeah, it's Wandile has spoken about it, and yeah, he has said everything perfectly.
But Maya, if I can just quickly come on, I mean, Courtney, you started off in your introductory remarks also saying about retailers are also engaging on a bit of leading to prices of the essential products rising and all of those discussions. I would say at the start of lockdown, there might have been suspicions until that, but I can tell you now, because what followed on that period in South Africa, Statistics South Africa pretty much releases now the price data of essential products, which is the medicine one, as well as the food products on a weekly basis, no longer on a CPI basis, or on a CPI form, which is on a monthly basis. So on a weekly basis, we are able to tell how much are all the prices of essential products, not only provincial, but at a district level, on a rural area side. And we'll see where there are hotspots. And with the data that we have, for example, the latest one coming out this afternoon, we are satisfied that the markets are operating well. And if there's anything, we're actually seeing deflation on the food products in South Africa, not an inflation side. So the price levels are accommodative, but the question is about the incomes and the people being out of work, but the products are not getting expensive at all.
Okay, so I I would love to ask a couple of questions, but can we start with talking specifically about food and the prices? Just because Wandile has just brought this up, what are the particular products that are being measured? Because yes, what are the particular products that are being measured, and what are those measurements against? Because if I go to the informal markets to purchase a bag of apples, and I pay 15 Rand for that bag of apples, and that same bag of apples costs 25, 30 Rand in the market at Checkers, let's say, Pick and Pay, and then what are the comparative measurements there? And so you spoke about this before, people are not being able to afford the food, but then also what particular products are being measured, because I'm using a bag of apples in particular because I've been complaining about how the bag of apples that I always buy is now 40 Rand, and 40 Rand seems like an incredibly ridiculous amount to pay for a bag of apples. So are all of the products being taken into account? Is this a percentage? And specifically, is there a breakdown based on the type of goods? So are canned goods and long-lasting goods continuing to be stabilized and decreasing? And can that be said for fresh goods as well? Please, if you know.
Yeah, I mean, look, the products that we measure are the products that consist of South Africa's consumer price index. On a food basket of the consumer price index, we have grain-related products, we have vegetables, we have fats and oils, we have meat, we have the entire food basket is there. The only reason that your bag of apples is getting expensive is because your bag of apples is out of season. So what gets to be more affordable at this time is largely around oranges. It will be on Maya's produce, also avocados and all of those things. Those you get them at relatively affordable price. But anything that is on the deciduous fruits, because of when the supply comes to market, it will be largely expensive now compared to, say, about 2 months ago or so. But it has less to do with the COVID-19 situation, and which products we include all of the product prices. But obviously, the measurements are happening at a formal retail level, because if you are collecting national statistics, you're collecting to registered businesses. That's where you get that. But the benefit of that is always the fact that in most cases, the formal retail level prices tends to be higher than what you find in the informal market if you're buying to somebody who's selling on a vendor and all of those things. Then that helps you, because right now, for example, the consumer price inflation in South Africa for food is 4.2 for March. If prices are rising at 4.2 in a formal retail level, then that means that prices of most products in the informal market, you're sitting on deflation. And even there, that increase is driven by few products. Many of them are really accommodative. So I would say, in as far as the pricing and everything is concerned, we are in right footing. No one is doing badly to anybody or anything. The pricing is reflective, is clear, it's accommodative of all the products.
And I want to come back to this thought and this question around how can we shorten the chain between the farm and the direct consumer? So how can we, so I'll particularly pose around what what are some things that could be suggested from the farm level or from an economist level around how we can ensure that, for example, that the right things are going into the parcels, that what there is a greater supply of is accessible to the communities-based organizations that are putting together additional parcels in addition to what the government may be distributing. I know one of the challenges that the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign has been hosting weekly calls. I mean, one of the challenges that have been identified is that there has been some challenge with some retailers around getting wholesale or decreased prices in order to purchase food for parcels. I mean, there has been challenge around identifying which things there have been challenges around putting together parcels that are filled with both fresh and long-term goods. So are there ways that the farm can be more involved in that? If food production is going well, then how can we decrease the amount of hunger that's being experienced directly related to COVID-19?
I just want to add something, or if I can start. I don't know if it's the responsibility of the farmer to intervene in that, because you have these established trading systems and markets where that's actually a lot of people's work and livelihoods is. Even if you look at small-scale farming systems, you have a lot of middlemen who actually will go to a farm, buy the produce, sell it to somebody else, who will then take it to the main town, and then a vendor there will eventually sell it. So now if you're cutting that process, you're actually putting a lot of people out of work, and you're maybe even compromising the ability of that farmer to get their produce to where it needs to go. So I think we need to trust in these systems, and if anything, we need to go to the market to put the parcels together and then maybe get it to somebody. But I think that these are established systems and they work, and I'm concerned about too much intervention there. I don't know if Wandile, you can add on that.
Yeah, I mean, Maya, you're 100% correct there. There is no need, at least in the South African food sector, to intervene or change anything in the markets. I mean, we designed this system in 1997, 1998, when we deregulated the South African agricultural markets, putting boards away and putting everything in an open market system. And we're at a mature stage right now. We know what happens where, how, at any moment. We have our fingers on the tips of the data point. The hunger is, again, not a problem of inefficiencies of the food chain. And it is not a problem of inefficiencies of the agricultural sector. It is people without jobs and without work. And the only thing to solve this is about thinking of how do we get people to actually be employed, and which then goes on to be a bigger macroeconomic question about how do you get South Africa growing? How do you get people to be absorbed in industries that are growing and having activity to then have income? Because you can't tell me that with the lockdown that has been only just in 3 weeks, there's already massive havoc of destruction. The massive havoc of destruction is going to happen in vulnerable communities that didn't have a stable income from the very start, and that were depending to the mobility of people in all of the city, in all of the areas. So the minute those people are out there and those businesses are out within that 3 weeks, obviously you will get all of these deep pain in communities. But to fix those, to make sure that you don't have all of those things, you have to think about broader goal about getting South Africa growing and getting South Africa absorbing people to work. If then some of the other people are already at the older age, they were not as fortunate to get formal education. You think about the industries that can absorb less skilled people to be able to absorb in those particular industries, as we think about reconstructing South Africa post-COVID-19. In the near term, I think that the goodwill that we can live on is saying, what sort of donations can we get to get food to people? What can the government do to get the food to people? And that obviously doesn't put away the farming businesses and the other businesses. Either you are on commercial services, you're on financial services. If you can put your hands together and see what hand can you lay on assisting on this, which is why I think the South African government has Solidarity Fund and all those kinds of instruments that they've put out there. And the private sector should do that in assisting on their communities. But I think the broader goal of making sure we don't have these vulnerabilities in our society is making sure that we grow the economy, we get as many people as we can working, and having some bit of a stable income. And I think in the long run will be better. But unfortunately, we're going to have to suffer the pain that we have because of the structure of our economy and our society that has been vulnerable. And to the point that was made at the beginning, that COVID-19 is just exposing some of the difficulties and the pain that have been on our societies. It's just that we haven't dealt with the structures of our society. So we can't point fingers on some of the other things that are on the sides, such as side variables, but we have to go straight to the core problem of why is our society the way that it is, and then address that if we are to get South Africa working properly post-COVID-19.
Thank you, thank you. So I think kind of while probably wrapping up here, are there other implications that we should be considering, that farms should be considering, small-scale farmers as well as commercial farms, as global warming continues to worsen situations? Some of our neighboring countries have experienced cyclones. South Africa has recently experienced a tornado. What are some other issues that we can be considering moving forward as pandemics may become more commonplace for us and other global warming related and environmental issues continue?
Look, I do hope, Courtney, that pandemics don't become more common, as you say. I do hope that we get one once in a while. We don't get frequent pandemics. That would be a bad society. But as to how will the system look, there is one concept, and I wrote about this on Project Syndicate about 2 weeks or so ago. There is going to be a big structural shift that is going to come to agriculture because of the pandemic. If you think about Germany, you think about the Netherlands, you think about France, Italy, the United States, largely their agricultural sector depends on migrant labor. The US, Mexico, in the side of Europe, from Eastern Europe, migrants that are depending there. Now, with the pandemic, what that has meant is that many of those migrant laborers were unable to get in those fields, and a number of the farmers, they have lost part of their crops, and a lot of destruction has happened, even though it didn't put them in a much more bad financial situation. Add that to the fact that we were talking earlier about some of the other meat plants not operating because of COVID-19 in parts of Canada and the US. I think all of these things, when one runs a much more bigger business and you have the balance sheet, what this will mean to you is that you need to move more towards automation at even a much more aggressive pace than what we're doing, so that you can depend very little to labor. But obviously we know that not everything can be automated. I mean, Maya knows better than me on this because she's working on the farming side. Some of the things can be automated, some of the things can't be automated. But I think if we imagine the future, the next decade or so, there's going to be a lot of that is going to be structurally changing the labor markets of agriculture. Now, if this begins in Europe as well as in North America region, South Africa is largely integrated in the global agricultural side. You're going to see the diffusion of that agriculture technology coming down here. And if it comes down here, it's a matter of a few years before you see that going on into the continent, particularly in countries like Nigeria, Kenya, and all of those with the higher income levels. So I think technology within the next decade or so is one of the things that is actually going to structurally change the agricultural labor market. And the catalyst for all of that is going to be the pains that those that are holding capital and the means of production have pretty much experienced because of COVID-19 in the Western world. And I think that is going to be changing the global space. But these are not things that will happen tomorrow. The structure that the guys at ZZ2 are in, which is a horticultural side, it might take a little bit of time before you able to have ability to automate a lot of that. But I think from the other agricultural components, either you're thinking on livestock or you're thinking on a grain production side, the technological absorption there might be a much faster pace than what would have happened. And that's the big take that I think for me, when I'm looking at the agricultural systems and structures globally, we're going to start to see coming out. Other than that, I think all other systems will remain in place. There's been talks of maybe the pandemic leading to each country being more protectionist, which we have seen in a number of countries, but I don't think that those policies will remain for longer, or the world will take that way. I'm only worried a lot about the pace of adoption of technology, which I think that it's going to be quicker than the pace that we would have anticipated before we entered this pandemic. Thanks.
I definitely want to agree with Wandile's points on automation, and it's something that's already happening, and it's going to continue to happen. And I just wanted to add to if these pandemics continue, if we're facing climate change, we're facing a lot of just economic change. And I think the success of a lot of farmers is going to come from their ability to adapt and their resilience. So if they can continue to access supplies, if they can continue to work with service providers, if one person is no longer able to function, can they find someone else to do the job? If they are able to just adapt to their conditions, even if that means, if they were working in a dry land system and now rain is not coming at the time that it used to, are they able to install irrigation systems and afford that? So I think, this is a lot of agricultural systems will have to become more resilient and adapt to change, which is inevitable, and it's coming from all these different angles. So, yeah.
Maya and Wandile, thank you so much. Thank you so much on behalf of the Forge for your participation here today, for your comments, for your thoughts, and very insightful, very educational for me. I learned a lot from this engagement. I am inclined to push the conversation forward for us to look at the other aspects and breakdowns in food accessibility, because as we all know and can agree that people are definitely hungry. I mean, this is a pre-existing situation that we've seen here in South Africa and lots of other places. Really appreciate the points around the other communities and countries that are even more vulnerable to food insecurity during this time. So yes, thank you so much for your points and your addition to the space today. We are going to close off here and look forward to having other conversations around hunger. Thank you guys so much. And thank you to the Forge for your continued efforts. And thank you to everyone who is tuning into this panel. We hope that this has been insightful for you as well.